Hey, FCBC family, it is Tuesday night, time for TNT Tuesday Night Teaching. And we are grateful for all of you who are joining. As you can see, this is not our regular TNT on tonight. We usually talk about and go deeper into the sermon from Sunday, but today is a special day. And because it's a special day, I figured that I would have some special people on TNT tonight. And so many of you who watched us in the past know that this is the Empowering Conversations crew. Maybe in the future we'll change that name. We got to find a sexy name for that. I don't know. But this is our Empowering Conversations crew. The Reverend Dr. Maurice Wallace, the Reverend Alicia Gordon, Pastor Heaven Bahani, and myself. And so we are grateful, so grateful to be here with you all on tonight. We're going to go for about an hour, end at 8. So many of you could continue doing what you were doing tonight, but I thought it was only right, given the event of today, that we would discuss feelings, thoughts, reflections. When the four of us get together, there is a lot of energy and synergy that takes place. And I have to let you know, we did not plan this. This is something that came together once that verdict dropped. I reached out to everybody and said, we gotta come on and bring the crew back for this and have a discussion. So we're going to get right to it. There's no necessarily plan of how we're going to move forward. We're just going to have a conversation. Feel free to ask any questions of the evening. Don't forget, as you join, shout out where you are joining from. Let us know where you are at this moment. And so grateful. So I'm gonna just kick it off, and we're going to start with Dr. Wallace, and then I'm gonna just have it go from there, from Reverend Gordon, and then Pastor Heaven. With regard to what are your thoughts now, given the verdict? What are you feeling? What are you thinking at this moment, Dr. Wallace?
Hello, everybody. Good to be with you again. I'm not going to say much in the way of preliminary. I'm going to try to do my best to answer the question. How do I feel? I feel, as I think many of us feel, relieved, profoundly relieved. And I cannot help but wonder if this verdict has rescued accountability's career, by which I mean, of course, that we have been here so often and been disappointed so often that I am confident that many of us would not have been altogether surprised if the verdict had gone the other way. In spite of what we've seen with our eyes, in spite of what we know in our bodies, in our spirits, in our souls, we have been disappointed and betrayed far too many times. But I think this occasion, this verdict has, if not recovered hope for some folk who were only hanging on barely to hope for this country, then at least the prospect of accountability for people in power and for those who have been called upon to serve and to protect. At least we have the sense that there may well be legal accountability now. My hope and my prayer, Pastor Mike, is this. I hope that this is not, I hope that this is precedence and not an exception to the rule. I hope that this is precedence and that going forward, we can come to expect right and just outcomes like this.
Good. Reverend Alicia?
See, this is the challenge of talking after Dr. Maurice. He take all the good ideas. And
I know.
I was like, oh, he talked about accountability, so I'm going to talk about setting the precedents. And he was like, no. I was sitting in the backyard and waiting for the verdict to come down. And when they gave the guilty, I cried in relief. I think both my body and my spirit was anticipating, right, the legacy and the track record that we've had in this country as it relates to this level of accountability. And so I did cry, tears of relief. And of course, like we always do, I get on social media, kind of see what folks talking about. And I was really taken aback because just as many, thank you guys, oh, guilty verdict, justice is served. I saw just as many, this ain't justice. This does not satisfy me, is what a lot of people were saying. And I was kind of like, hey, I wasn't expecting that, but I saw something on Facebook that somebody posted. It says, I find it difficult to rejoice for justice when the winner must die. And I was like, dang. Right. And I think that's what has been what both Dr. Maurice has said and some of the commentary that's been said on CNN and MSNBC and other places is that we always talk about justice. And what this is a matter of accountability, right? About how do we take account for our actions. And that is essentially what we have been asking for, what we're talking about. And I like that word accountability is coming up in this conversation so early, is because we're so quick to ask for justice. We have historically been asking for justice, often leaning into a system that is not designed to offer justice, right? But when you begin to look at literally the word of accountability, it means to simply take an account for your actions.
Yeah.
And account for your actions in the same systemic way, in the boxes that we have said, like, this is the law, right? And so this level of accountability, this word accountability for me begins to almost level the playing field a little bit, to say, like, we are asking for everyone to have the same access and the same accountability when it comes to these things. And so, that was my initial response. And I'm glad that the conversation has taken this turn toward accountability. And that's all I got so far.
Yeah. Pastor Heaven?
Man, so you guys all said the great stuff. I was going to talk about accountability. Thank you, Alicia. But I think, I'll be honest, I am still sort of in a state of, I don't want to use the word disbelief, but more so just taking this moment all in. I don't really think I have a full sort of understanding of what this, how this moment is impacting me. I don't know if it's because there's just a level of, you just become immune to the fact that time and time again, you keep getting the same, result. And so when the moment does come where accountability shows up, it's almost like you don't even know how to react to that moment, because it's not a moment that we're used to experiencing. A couple of things that that have been coming to mind is that I understand that, this will hopefully set a precedent, but we understand that laws don't necessarily change people. They just hold them accountable. And behavior doesn't change because, a law is set. But what I was thinking about and I was wondering was thinking about the police officers, right, that are witnessing this moment and the impact that it now has on their psyche, and not in a negative way, but how they are now positioning themselves to do their job. Is this moment impacting them in such a way that it's making them question, even if maybe, let's say that at the end of the day, we can't change their, they're not individuals that are willing to change their heart, their perception of the world, but at least are they willing to do their job right? And how is this moment showing up? Is it impacting them? Is it setting a fear inside of them? Are they going to be now thinking with a level of responsibility and knowing that this system can hold them accountable, right? For so long, there was a moment where, there was some, of course, our community likes to make memes. And they talked about, the moment that, Siobhan's, Derek, he read the verdict and his face was like, I can't believe this is happening. And so there was a moment that showed I don't know if the word of it is, because it's not police have always been seen as this sort of entity within society that was untouchable.
Mm-hmm.
They have now been touched. What now? What next? What happens next within these departments? Are they going to change their rules and regulations? Are commanding officers going to speak to their, is this going to enact the change? Because at the end of the day, these laws and these precedents we can put them in place, but how does that then trickle down to behavior? So that's kind of where I'm probably just sitting and wrestling in with it. And I'd be curious to probably talk to, some officers and see what their thoughts are on this moment and the way it's going to position them to do their jobs moving forward. Because in conjunction to here after Benjamin Crump, he mentioned that he was getting ready to go to Texas for another, woman who had been killed and shot by the police. And it was it was like that moment of celebration and that constant reminder that that this is still happening.
Yeah.
And so it's like, there was that juxtaposition between we can celebrate, but also realizing that this is still a constant reality for Black and brown people that they have to face and navigate in life.
Yeah, I'll say this. I'm gonna try my best to play moderator of the panel tonight and just feed off of you all. But I will say this. I think one of the best quotes I've heard, not related to the George Floyd murder, but really Daunte Wright, who we're still having to deal with. It was his mother. His mother made a statement. She said, I can get no justice. She said, justice will be my son coming home.
Right.
She said, but we can have accountability. I think sometimes we get caught in just repeating, chants. And we've been so accustomed to using the word justice. This is not necessarily justice. As you said, Alicia, and as Daunte Wright mother said, because George Floyd is dead. He's not alive. But accountability. And I'm so glad that Dr. Maurice started there, because I think that's what has to happen. The only way you get changes in behavior for police is if we raise the bar of accountability, so that they have to think twice. This is not about policing tactics. This is really about an officer or what we know a legacy of over policing, aggressiveness that has become deadly, looking through the lens of an individual and not seeing their humanity. Beginning of this trial, looking at that tape over and over, 9 minutes now, 29 seconds, as we now found out, to think that you could keep your knee on the neck of a human being when you know he's no longer conscious or a threat. There's something flawed about Officer Chauvin in terms of how he's moving through this Black man. And so we know that legacy. So I love the conversation on accountability, because I think that's critical. I want to pose another question, and we'll start with Reverend Alicia on this one. So I too, like you, Reverend Alicia, saw a lot of the social media comments, and actually some even TV pundits, some African Americans, once the verdict was read. What does it say? And I'm sure Pastor Heaven will chime in on this. What does it say when the trauma that we collectively experience is so deeply entrenched that victory becomes unrecognizable? like I'm not saying there's not work to do, but I feel like celebrating this moment is not a betrayal of the cause.
Yeah.
So what is the connection, you think, between trauma and sometimes the inability? Because it's not just about the community, it's all of us. We experience trauma. When you do good, you can't recognize it. When you have a good moment, you can't celebrate it. So what does that do collectively when we have a hard time at this moment, just honoring this particular verdict in this particular moment?
Yeah. And I appreciate that question, because it really digs into my reaction that I saw on Facebook of people like, we ain't got time to be celebrating. I was like, hold on, folks. Right? Dr. Gregory Ellison at Emory University, he talks a lot about this notion of interrupted hope, right? Where we have these moments of hope that life will be better, hope that we will experience justice, or, all of these things. And then something comes and tries to interrupt that, right? And he talks about this notion of working around that. How do we begin to use our stories and narratives to bring that all back together? But I think at the core of it, Pastor Mike, is that the inability to rejoice and the inability to have joy in the moment is the result of trauma.
Yeah.
It really is, right? And I think that is why the work that we do at FCBC and other places across Harlem and the city of offering things like free mental health opportunities, group conversations like this, where people even on their computers can really talk through what they're experiencing, is that this is the result of trauma. When you have these moments of hope that are interrupted with the realities of life. I've just literally, while we were on this call, I saw there was a police shooting. A young girl in Columbus, Ohio was shot and killed by the police. An hour ago on my Twitter timeline. So I think that I this is not something in which we talk about binaries. There's this gray scale. There's this nuance of why people find it hard, that even in moments of joy, to rejoice, and we understand that. But I want to offer that in this space because I think somebody asked the question about what do we do after we celebrate. But I do want to offer in this space that to undo trauma is to do the practice of joy. To begin to rewire our brains, rewire our thinking, rewire the molecular structures of our bodies. So often we talk about trauma as a behavioral response and it is in a lot of ways, that we need to change our behaviors. But when you are from a group of people where trauma is in your DNA, you have to be in a place where you practice joy, where you have to rewire the way that you think and speak. We talk so much about that in our circles, about rewiring ourselves. So I want to encourage us and all of us who are watching that, yes, there are so many realities here, right? But this is the moment where we practice having joy, even if you don't feel it, that you begin to switch something in your brain and in your mind and in your speech to say that in this moment, I can rejoice because someone was held accountable for our collective trauma. And I just think that is such an important way to think about that. It doesn't have to be black or white either or, but it is something that people who have had centuries of traumatic experiences actually sometimes have to practice what it's like to be rejoiceful.
I want you to add on to that, Pastor Evan, from a clinical perspective.
Mm-hmm. I think she gave the clinical. I was
that was the undo trauma is the practice of joy.
That is, I mean, I don't really want to add more to it. I think I want to just reaffirm what Alicia's saying. Yeah. But that is true. And I think a part of that also is it's living in the tension with the reality of the moment, which is the guilt that people still feel, right? That George is not here. So you're celebrating the absence of someone not being present, right? And so that comes from a place of loss and grief, right? And choosing, and it's this, and choosing yet to say that in this moment, that it's not that I'm celebrating that this person had to die so this moment could happen, right? I'm celebrating because the system has now worked in a way that is now holding the injustices that we witness on a consistent basis accountable. And to Alicia's point, is that if we don't lean into those moments of joy, what's going to happen is when we continue to find ourselves, because we know the fight is not over, right? When we know that the fight, and I'm kind of almost a little bit leaning into my sermon. Anyways, hold back. But no, it's when you choose to lean into those moments of joy because you know that the road ahead, there's still more work to be done. Mm-hmm. And in order to be able to do the work ahead, you have to be able to sit in the moments of joy to fuel you, to keep you going, so that when you find yourself needing to pull from that space of resilience that says, I'm going to keep going and fighting for justice. I'm going to keep going and keep marching and keep, doing X, Y, and Z in my community so that if it does not happen again, or so that if this does happen again, we know what to do and we know how to move and we know how to operate. And so I just want to reaffirm it's in those places that's how you counter the trauma, is by fully leaning into those moments of joy, to allow yourself to be replenished enough to experience and to be able to do the work that is coming ahead, that we know is coming.
Let me add, because I want to clarify, because every now and again I see a comment that I feel like I need to clarify from Sister Lynn, that we shouldn't accept trauma as part of our DNA. No one is accepting trauma as part of the DNA. We are recognizing that we have really traumatized people historically in this country.
Mhm.
Recognizing the trauma does not mean you surrender to it, but recognizing the trauma helps understand some of the pathologies that are birthed from the trauma that exists in our community today. So I want to be clear. You don't look for trauma as a standard. You recognize trauma as a reality, especially of a collective history and experience of a people in this country. And that is real. So when we talk about trauma, it is just as racism is in the DNA of America, people of African descent have had that traumatizing experience, the trauma of slavery, the trauma of abuse, the trauma of brutality. All of that has become part of the collective psyche. Now, do you surrender to it? No, but you have to recognize it, or real healing doesn't take place in that regard. Thank you for that comment, Sister Lynn. Dr. Maurice, I want to shift another bit. There are people who, there was a comment earlier I read, and there are people, we use the word movement a lot.
Yeah.
And I'm always slow to use that word in moments, right? Do you see, and it's just me asking, all that led up to this as one movement? Do you, as part of a movement? Is this just a moment? How do you place this historically?
That's an excellent question, and it's a tough one. I think a response to it depends significantly on historical perspective, where you're standing at any given moment. I think it's possible for us to step back to 1955 and see the long view, Emmett Till. And I heard George Floyd's brother say today that Emmett Till was the first George Floyd, right? So I think that is a reasonable position to take, and therefore it's reasonable to see the activity and the activism and the efforts and the struggles between those deaths and the probably hundreds, thousands in between as continuous. But I don't think that, I do think it's important that we pause and recognize that, to go back to something I heard Reverend Alicia say, that just as there is interrupted hope, there is interrupted movement, right? And we have to proceed deliberately and intentionally. And I think to the degree that we can articulate a certain kind of forward movement, that, and it's hard to measure what movement is, right? It's hard to decide that our embodied protests, it's hard to measure how much or how significant that embodied protest was to any given outcome, right? Because what we're also seeing is that some protests, significant protest is local. Movement may be local, that might not be national. Sometimes national protests don't happen at the local level, or it's not felt at the local level. So I think we have to be intentional and at every turn qualify what we mean, because we don't want to empty movement of meaning, right? We don't want it to mean whatever is convenient to identify our sense of our part in what is unfolding around us, because we have to have a critical position toward movement too. We have to know when the movement is forward and when movement is backward, right? And so I think that's probably the sort of best way I can imagine how to think deliberately and intentionally about movement. I think we have to continue I'll put it this way. I prefer struggle, frankly. I like to think about struggle because not that movement is in itself an unproductive or unfruitful term, but for me, struggle is sobering. Struggle is also the idea that we are strenuously exerting ourselves. When we risk movement being confused with just getting caught up and being carried, right? We're not being carried. We are strenuously exerting ourselves.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I'm happy to be corrected on that, but that's my thinking where I am right now. I do want to say, if I may quickly, to go back to your previous question about joy and about celebration. And I think that Pastor Heaven and Reverend Alicia answered that question brilliantly. But I want to tack on this humbly. I want to tack on this afterthought. What if what we're seeing is not exactly elation, but exhalation, right? We are finally breathing, and we feel like we can breathe for a moment. And the worry, though, is that once we have this moment where we can breathe, we wonder when the air is going to run out again.
Right.
So we don't want to rejoice so much that all the air gets sucked up, and here we are drowning all over again, right? And so I'm really thinking about this breathing piece, because so much of our conversation in these first 30 minutes has been about how we experience this verdict in our bodies.
Yeah.
You notice that? Pastor Mike, when you started, you didn't ask us what we thought. You said, what do you feel? This is about how we experience victory and or defeat in our bodies. And the thing that's so striking to me is whether we call it trauma or not, it has a real physiological impact on us. I heard George Floyd's brother say, "I can finally get some sleep."
Yeah.
And you know, we might easily laugh that off and be happy for him, but imagine what it does to the body not to get sleep from May till April. That's what racism does to our bodies.
Yeah.
Can you imagine how short now his life expectancy is? Because he hasn't been able to sleep for almost a year. And my wife told me just recently that since last April, Black male life expectancy has decreased 3 years.
Yep.
Right. Wow.
It's funny
That's
you said
crazy.
It's funny you just brought that up. I don't know if you saw a study just came out that said if people in their middle age who don't get at least 6 hours of sleep every night are more likely to develop dementia in their 70s. That's sometimes the physiological, and I think you hit it. You know, Pastor Heaven knows what I'm talking about. We talk about this embodied trauma syndrome, right? Then I think you hit on the head. I want to also point another observation before I move to the next question. You know, I heard today many people saying, we know this, that, you know, having a videotape murder was no guarantee, right? And in this case, we've seen the videotape not work before. I remember what happened right after the Rodney King verdict and how we were all shocked. But it stands to reason that moments of accountability can come. Since I like the way you referenced the Emmett Till and George Floyd, think about it, that accountability comes because we had tape, and recognition came Emmett Till because we had a body. Think about the untaped and unfound bodies that have passed with no knowledge, right? Culturally, in our midst, and historically, and today is one of those moments where the countless, to me, untaped bodies. It becomes a collective moment, as you said, of exhaling, but also it is victory because there are countless Black and brown bodies where there was no videotape, where there was no one who had the technology, who this would have been brushed under the rug, and the family would have been mourning with no answers in grief. So I think that has to be recognized on that level. I think something I want to raise.
Mike, I just wanted to say something. As Dr. Maurice was talking, I actually looked up on the screen on my TV and I saw, an older gentleman on the television crying, and it made me think about, as you were saying that this exhalation moment for many, and then the celebration that we're seeing, the tears. This is probably the one time I've seen grown men cry from all different socioeconomic backgrounds, men and women, right? But particularly, I want to lean into the emotion of men, because that's not often something that we see very visibly. This exhalation moment is also an indication and probably in relationship to the lived experiences that Black and brown people, Black men and Black women have experienced in their interactions with police. So there is this, so it's not a vindication of that moment, but it's a vindication of my own personal experiences as being in this. So I'm not there, Derek Chauvin is not just the killer of George Floyd, but he's now a symbol of every cop that has disturbed and killed and the peace of Black and brown people in this country. And he's emblematic of that. And so when you see him walk away in handcuffs, you're seeing as a vindication moment for Joy, but it's also a vindication moment for every experience, every moment that you felt the fear of when you had a police officer come behind you. And the alarm when, and the sirens went off, that sense of fear when you see, it's all of that. And to see, and I think, Pastor Desiree had shared that, in Harlem, that there were people who were chanting and screaming. And, I can imagine that there were people from all different socioeconomic backgrounds, because once again, it was a vindication because for Black and brown people, it's always been them versus us. It's never been a moment where we've been in relationship with them. It's always them versus us. And so in this moment, it was them won. We won. Yeah. We got, and whether or not we wanted, but that is also, I think, at play as what was happening, what we're visiting.
I agree. Yeah. I'm not going to direct this last three, I would say, I'm always thinking music, last three movements of this talk I want us to enter, and you all respond freely to this. I'm going to make a statement, and then I want you all to react to what I say. Today, a verdict, we got the verdict that many doubted would happen, but we received it. Guilty on all three counts, three charges. And I don't want to let a moment pass when we don't think about civic responsibility. If we think that the makeup of that jury had nothing to do with the outcome of this case. I know there were 4 Black men in particular on that jury.
Right.
And I think 6 people of color total, and one who identified as mixed race. I think that was it. And then the other were white. I think we can't negate that the reason why in the long ago you would have never seen this is because we were not on the jury, because we could not vote, that we could not make these decisions. In the midst of this, what does it say about the need for us to be intentional about our own civic engagement? I just felt I wanted to inject that statement because I don't want that moment to be missed, because there's always protest is I think a way that we continue to walk and embrace and embody. But a particular kind of engagement and commitment made this happen today. We would love to believe in a perfect world that wouldn't matter who was on the jury, but we know that's not the case. No, that's not. So just tell me, react to that.
Well, I wanted to say that just this one thing I'll say, and I'll let I was watching one of the maybe might have been CNN or one of the news, and they were sharing how every one of the jurors, when they were being selected, emphasized that they wanted to be a part of this case because they understood the gravity and the magnitude of this moment and being engaged. And yes, of course, in a situation like that, many would have either decided to not be in that position but to stand up and to say, because of the scrutiny, that the possible scrutiny of the potential outcome and how it could have went. But the fact that they wanted to, that they were willing participants, that they went in with the willingness, and most people who go into jury selection are like trying to answer questions to try and dodge and avoid. But it also made me think about, to your point, Pastor Mike, when we're talking about civic engagement, we always ask the question, well, what do we do, right? Well, what does it look like for you to be the willingness to want to be a part of the next jury selection, to be a part of the next jury, to know that your lived experiences that you're bringing to that moment creates and has value. And so maybe it's not a George Floyd case, but it's a case of a simple shoplifting case, right? It could be something, whatever the case may be, but the willingness for us to say, how can we actively participate, to say that we can now bring our lived experiences, and the willingness to want to be a part of those systems.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that. I historically, to be honest, I used to always be the person who did not want to go to jury duty. Like, I don't want no parts. I don't want to sit in on a case talking about no asbestos in no building for 12 weeks. Like, no, thank you. But somebody actually checked me on Facebook one year. I was moaning and complaining about going to jury duty, and they checked me on the timeline. I was just like, listen, we need people to want to do jury duty. No, it might not be a case that, like I said, some kind of civil thing. But when we think about all of the work that we have done for voters' rights, right, to get people to the polls, and all of the stuff that comes with why we push people to vote. When we talk about overturning systems, let me take it back. When we talk about overturning or having an influence on the outcomes of people's lives in a very particular, localized way, right? Because you're only called to the jury as jury of your peers. So, you're in Harlem, you do Harlem cases, whatever, or New York City, whatever the case may be. But when we really think about this notion of civic duty and the role that jury selection or being a part of a jury plays, we really do have the ability and the power to shift the outcomes of people's everyday life. And I love that Pastor Heaven used something like shoplifting as an example, right? Because over a certain amount, it becomes like a felony case. And then, depending on who your lawyer is, you may go to court. And what does it mean to have people with a lived experience of what it means to be poor, Black, and disenfranchised, to be in a jury or to have influence on a case that can determine the trajectory of a young man or a young woman's life for the rest of their lives, right? And so I just love that this is kind of like popping up, especially in the context of we've been talking about voting for so long, about the role that being a part of juries really does play in a really contextualized way, because these juries really are made up of people in your neighborhood and in your community, right? And that shared lived experience has a bigger impact than I think we realize.
Yeah, I want to ask Dr. Maurice something, because I thank you both for that, because it's a strong reminder of why voting, that's how you get in that jury. Voting is critical, right? That we can't bypass that we get a say when we vote, not just in terms of elected officials, but opportunity to serve on juries. Dr. Maurice, I want to ask you a very particular question. Today, as I was watching the coverage, just after the verdict came down, I was looking at MSNBC. I don't know if you saw it. They interviewed a white man who was in tears. And they asked him basically what this moment meant. And he didn't just talk about the verdict, but he talked about what seeing the George Floyd murder did. And he said something that I think is important. He said, this moment and the death of George Floyd helped him to see his privilege. And he got emotional, right? Because he said, and seeing my privilege and knowing basically what I would never have to go through on many levels is why he was there. In the outside the courtroom with the Black Lives Matter mask on. Talk, Dr. Maurice, about what we need to see in this from those who claim to be allies.
Great question. You know, what's interesting about that observation, I didn't hear this gentleman, though I saw several minutes of MSNBC earlier today. What's especially interesting to me about his observation is that the thing he saw was his own privilege. He saw who he was not likely ever to become in the person of George Floyd. But the thing I would also call his attention to is what Dr. King referred to as man's inhumanity against man, right? I want him to see the possibility of what whiteness is, means, how it has violently exercised itself on Black bodies. So I'm really interested in the ways in which we're not only talking about how important it is for our allies to see Black people as humans. I also want them to recognize the degree of inhumanity that is in a figure like Chauvin, right? We know that that George Floyd was a human being. What we've not talked about, though, is just how inhuman Derek Chauvin was. Let's talk about that, because what we don't want from allies is pity.
Good.
That's not what we want. That's not what we want. You to take stock of yourself.
Say that.
Right?
Yes.
We want you not to protect or feel like you have to have some feeling of protectiveness over George Floyd. But what about correction of Derek Chauvin? Right? I want to know, when is whiteness going to intervene in those moments that might otherwise have made this a non-issue, right? Had somebody on the police force intervene, we wouldn't be talking about a trial.
Correct.
Or not this one, certainly, right? So I want to shift the emphasis a bit off of the dying of George Floyd, and I want to talk about and have people think about the inhumanity of those kinds of violences on Black bodies. We have to put that, to me, that's what's on trial. That's what's on trial. Because here's the thing, we wouldn't think well of Derek Chauvin if he had his knee on the neck of a dog for that long. So it's not just about treating George Floyd as a human being, it's about being a human being as a police officer.
Before you say something,
humane.
But before you say something, I don't want to sidetrack this conversation. I just want to make an observation, and then Revolution can go, and then I want to hit a last question and give everybody a chance to kind of get at it. I want to make an observation, though, because it's worth in another conversation. Because I love what you said about we don't want pity, right? Because pity leads to the kind of missionary impulse that led to slavery, right? So we don't want that. That is a beautifully said. But I want to add something. Another conversation, not for us. It's one that has to be had. Well, it can be. We might point it out to white folk, and that is, not only should the conversation move to looking at the inhumanity of Chauvin and the inhumanity of structures of whiteness as well.
Right.
But notice in the trial who they ignored. Chauvin, the police. They ignored someone who was trained to save lives, who happened to be a white woman. So they ignored the paramedic who was pleading for the humanity of George Floyd, and the white man ignored the pleas from this white woman who was trained to save lives. That's they got to wrestle with.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But it is interesting. It's interesting to notice the large issues within whiteness that we know are real, within that lay the foundation for structures of patriarchy and all that that is real as well. But the time we have left, because I want to honor the time.
Can I insert this real quick?
Yes, sir.
On the ally question, very, very quickly, I would challenge those who might wish to identify themselves in solidarity with our struggle to move beyond the category and the identity of ally and declare yourself an anti-racist. Because there's a kind of activity that comes with that. An ally may be sympathetic, but I don't know if I can count on someone who is sympathetic to have my back when I need it most. I want to know somebody who is committed to anti-racism, whether it happens to me or my neighbor or someone across the country. I think that is a far more virtuous identity to occupy, in my humble opinion.
No, I like that. I want to start with Reverend Alicia, then Pastor Heaven, and Dr. Maurice on this question. It's a big one. This is a big question, so we're not going to get it all out, but I want to honor one of the questions of one of those who are viewing tonight with the time we have. And I'm going to do it in the classic King question. Where do we go from here?
Where do we go from here?
Where do we go from here?
I felt that exhale. I felt that exhale.
I don't know where we go from here, but that question makes me want to literally explicate the question, defining where.
Good.
Right? Do we, like, who's the we here? Like, where is the where a geographical location? Is a state of mind? Is it an ideal state? I want to really explicate the question as a part of our collective homework, right? Where do we go, right? This movement, is it movement or is it moment? Like this action, right? From here, I think out of all those words, we probably can best define the here, like we can name and situate ourselves. But I think our collective homework, I don't have a real answer for King or for you, PM, but I think our collective homework is to really unpack the words of those questions, because in our small circles, in our churches, in our communities, to define the collective destination or the collective mindset or the collective outcome, defining who it is that we are taking on this journey, and thinking about, all of those pieces is a part of our collective work that helps us get to a better understanding of what an answer can be. That's my 2 cents on that one.
I love it. Pastor Heaven. I said it's big.
I know. Where do we go from here? I'm still trying to think about that one. I think from this, and I don't want to speak too like long term into the future, but I think from the immediacy of what we can do is to I think one is for when we're talking, when I say we, I'm going to be talking about Black people. So I'm going to define it for the way that I'm responding to this statement. But I think, dang, Pastor Mike, we have to be intentional about seeking out life-affirming spaces that will in turn provide us an alternative, I don't want to say alternative, but provide us a sense of hope that we can lean into. Because the work that we're going to attempt to do, the question of where do we go from here, it requires a level of work from both people, right? It requires a level of and it's transformational work that is both spiritual, physical, and mental, and also systematic. Right. So you have all these 4 components. And the best thing I think that we can do in the immediacy is seeking out these life-affirming spaces that we can either plug into that will replenish us, but also allow for us to put our hands to the plow. And there is so much localized work that we can be doing. Right. So now I'm going to speak from a practical level. There's a lot of localized work that we can be doing and engaging in. and having conversations about and participating in, that can dramatically change the impact of our very sort of immediate local sphere. And sometimes we focus so heavily on sort of the national, which is how do we change, which is true, right? All of these moments, but how do we find these localized moments that we can participate in while simultaneously also being affirmed with life. So I think it's a combination of it's that balance between, okay, I have to do the work. So how do I find these spaces within my community where I can engage? And that can happen from a myriad of different ways, because systemic racism impacts so many different things, from housing to, the work that Alicia does with single mothers, right? These are all the ways in which racism flows and impacts. And so even if you're not working on the front lines of, say, police brutality, right, you are still valuing and doing the work of the sanctity of life. And I think if we are all participating in ways that affirms, values, and protects life, I think that's essentially, and if we are able to locate what that looks like for us as individuals, I think then we can get to a place where we're moving towards sort of an overall systemic change.
Before Dr. Maurice gives his comments, I want to recognize if you can post Mr. Producer Shakira O'Kane's statement, because I love that. It's always good when you see people take away from the conversation. She had 3 pieces from this convo that I feel like I need to be intentional about my practice of joy. I need to understand what the localized work is and how I can elevate it. Even a simple share on Facebook at the start, and I need to serve the next time jury service comes up. So thank you for that. That's what we're talking about.
That's fantastic.
It is being empowered to now change habits and shift engagement. Dr. Maurice?
So I appreciate that very much. I do have a pretty succinct response to the question. In all fairness, I've had a longer time to think about it than Reverend Alicia and Pastor Heaven. But I have 2 sort of responses to it. And one of them is very much like Reverend Alicia's concern for the question itself. Where do we go from here? I don't know who asked the question, and I hope this reply doesn't sound flippant. It isn't intended to sound flippant, but I'm really interested in this question because I get it quite a lot. The question, where do we go from here, is a good one. But my further question is, if I tell you, are you going to go? If I tell you, are you willing to go? Because I think often what is being asked is a certain kind of expertise that is winnowed down to a nugget. And I can't speak in sound bites. I'm not good at it. So unless you want something that's sustained and thoughtful, don't ask me. But on the other hand, let me say this, because I've had some time to think about it. Where do we go from here? We go to the closest Black bookstore.
Come on.
By which I mean, really educate yourself. Let's get educated together. Whether you read a book alone, or whether you engage in a study group, or whether you take a class at the community college, it is essential that we not only educate ourselves, but educate ourselves well. Because there's a lot of information, and one has to be able to distinguish the good from the bad. It's not that we don't have access to information. It's that we don't always have, we haven't refined our critical tools a lot to know what's worth sort of consuming and what's not as valuable as other things might be. So I would say, educate oneself and serve on a jury, go to the next school board meeting, go to the next city council meeting. Wherever your education leads you is where I think you have to go. But educating ourselves is really, really important. We have to consider, for the example, that the laws in each state around what's the threshold is for convicting a Derek Chauvin vary state to state, right? And we have to know that so that we don't celebrate too soon, or we don't get into debates that aren't based on good information. You can get distracted on bad information. So I'm just an advocate for educating ourselves.
I'm with you. I often tell people, I say it facetiously but seriously, that our cell phones are to be used for more than Candy Crush, and that we have libraries in our phones, and we could read and research right there. I mean, I will say this. I thought about what you said about anti-racist practices and Dr. Maurice, and about pity. And I asked the question to get responses. I too am like all of you in some ways. There's no quick soundbite response. I want to let your response kind of get us all thinking. But I do want to say something. And I go back to the example of the white the gentleman who was crying today, who said that the George Floyd death, murder, helped him to see his privilege. I think for those white brothers and sisters, I think here, where do we go from here? Here is that recognition. Because let's be honest, the only reason why some whites who were now engaged in anti-racist practice because of this George Floyd, or whom, even though Dr. Morrison liked the language, is still being used, some who see themselves as allies, anti-racist, what have you. The reason why many of them were able to engage is because there were no cultural distractions because of this pandemic.
Oh yeah.
That the pandemic gave a pause to see.
Woo.
And for some, they would not have seen without the pause. And so I think here for would-be anti-racist white revolutionaries, freedom workers, freedom, what you call it. You look historically, whether it was white abolitionists, white freedom riders, whites who were in the struggle, as you say, I think there had to be a recognition of the inhumanity. There had to be a recognition of the disparities. There had to be a recognition of the privilege, and something within them had to say that they could not remain in a space of disengagement and sit on the sidelines because something was being lost in their humanity at the same time. So I think at the end of the day, there is work to do. And I think, as you all have alluded to, the work looks different in different ways and in different settings and in different contexts. But this season, in this moment, as we all know, is one that we pause, celebrate, but realize that there's still a season that, unfortunately, in order for awareness to take place, blood must be shed, and lives are still being lost. And that means this work doesn't stop. And that means what each of you do in your various areas contribute to the struggle for liberation and the work I think that we are all in some way called to do. And so I'm grateful for all of you tonight, and grateful to call you all friend and colleagues, and thankful that you all were able to contribute to this and be a part of this in last minute notice. So thank you for that, and grateful. And so, family, all of you who've been watching tonight, thank you. We can go on and on. I know that. And I know we can go on and on. And on and on and on. But somebody said, Reverend Alicia, just waiting on the full practice joy sermon. So we're going to have to create a space so you can give that sermon. All right. But I want to say thank you to all of you who've been watching tonight. Thank you for the questions and the comments. This work is not relegated just to us, it's all of us. We all have to find ways to engage in transformative and transcendent work that is steeped in love and shaped by our compassion. And so this crew, you see, this is our Empowering Conversations crew. I just want to let you know, we are going to be back next month in May for our Empowering Conversations again with this crew. And I'm so excited and I'm grateful for all of you. And so on behalf of Dr. Maurice, Pastor Heaven, Revelation, myself, thank you all for tuning in. God bless.
Much love.
Good night. Peace and blessings. And we continue to push forward. The struggle continues.
That's right. That's right.
Peace, everybody.
Later.